All right, a little peek behind the curtain here. Oh, peek. How about that? Look at that. I made a pun and I didn't even realize it. Right off the bat, huh? Is this guy on his game or what? A little peek behind the curtain here on the Morning Pitt, in our production and what we do. So obviously Pitt played Gardner-Webb last night at the Peterson Events Center. We're not going to talk about that today, and the reason is pretty simple. I didn't want to come home from the game around 10 or 11 o'clock last night and record another Morning Pitt video. It's just I didn't feel like staying up that late. So we'll talk a little basketball tomorrow on the Morning Pitt. Today we're going to recap a couple football topics. Now, it kind of lined up well. Because my initial plan was to stay up later and record that thing. But I'm getting old and I'm still sort of recovering from Saturday night's super late live stream. Obviously, a Morning Pitt taped after the basketball game last night would not be quite as late. But that was my intention. I was like, I'll get home and I'll just, I'll get home from the game and record it and talk about the game and Amsel Delilich and all that stuff. But then we had Pat Narduzzi's press conference yesterday, and his weekly press conference. I can't say it's always the most newsworthy event, but it sort of felt there were a handful of things that I wanted to talk about. And so it sort of lined up nicely. I was like, you know what? I'll just talk about Narduzzi and some of the things he talked about today. And then tomorrow we'll talk about the basketball game. We'll have a little bit of time to process. I'll be able to see what all the smart basketball people have to say about things. And then I'm not going to say I would steal all their ideas, but I'll at least be inspired and pointed in the right direction so I don't come out and say more stupid things than I usually do, or more stupid things than I need to. So let's talk a little bit of Pitt football stuff. I think Pat Narduzzi hit on some interesting topics yesterday during his weekly press conference. This team is very much at a what's the right cliche? It's not a point of no return because no matter what happens on Saturday against Clemson, they're going to play the two final games. It's a pivotal point in the season, but I think it's been a pivot. I mean, they've been on a series of pivotal points for about the past 5 games. So it's not just that. It's not a before and after moment because look, no matter what they do against Clemson, yeah, that'll get, if they win that game, that gets them to 8-2. That's great, but they could still lose the final 2. I mean, it doesn't guarantee anything about what the final 2 games are, but I think they're at a critical point in this season with regards to the offense, with regards to the roster, with regards to the direction they take going forward for the final 3 games. And I've talked a lot about what I thought it meant when they made such a drastic move with the reshuffling of the offensive line and kind of what that said about the staff and how they felt about the state of things with the offense and with the line. And so I've talked about that, and I think it's clear that they sort of feel like they're at a crossroads, maybe a crossroads is the cliche we'll go with here. How about that? That'll be our preferred cliche for this current state until I think of something better later in the week. But for now, it is a crossroads for this team where they've got to try and find answers. And I asked Pat Narduzzi yesterday. It was the first question of the press conference. I said, all right, so you've reshuffled the offensive line. You made all these changes on the offensive line. You've seen both quarterbacks, not necessarily by choice, but you've seen both quarterbacks. You put a bunch of receivers out there. You've used different running backs, different tight ends, all the different. Like, what's still on the table for you in terms of adjustments you can make to get this thing righted? And I think his response was interesting. Not necessarily because it answered my question, because it didn't. But it did sort of shed some light on a few different things. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of the insight Pat Narduzzi shared yesterday, even if he didn't intend to do so. Let's talk about an interesting update on Rodney Hammond that you might have seen a little bit about. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the injury situation. And let's talk about an interesting comment Narduzzi made about Eli Holstein that I think sheds a lot of light on Holstein and maybe this whole offense right now and the overall sort of psyche of this offense and this team. So we got a lot to get to. We got a lot to talk about. So let's dive into it here on the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Tuesday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. It's Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. You see the website below. All the Pitt sports news you can possibly handle, football, basketball, recruiting, and everything else going on in the world of Pitt sports, plus the message boards where you can talk to other Pitt fans all day, every day. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com to get all the Pitt sports coverage really everything you could possibly want. And like I say, the message boards, you can talk with other Pitt fans. We always ask you to do like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. These daily morning Pitt videos, our weekly live stream every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m., our post-game shows, which will be at a far more manageable hour on Saturday after the Clemson game. Hopefully around 6 or so, depends on when we get back from the stadium. It won't be like 1 a.m. like it was last week or was for the Syracuse game. It'll be a little bit more of a reasonable time of day. Eat a little dinner, have some drinks, and talk a little Pitt sports. That'll be a lot of fun. Hopefully you can tune in on Saturday night right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And if you're subscribed to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, you have your notifications turned on. You saw the video pop up yesterday of Pat Narduzzi's press conference. And Narduzzi covered a lot of topics in about 15 minutes or so. It was actually one of his shorter Monday press conferences, weekly press conferences. He usually gets closer to around 20 minutes. This one was a little bit shorter, but I think he covered some interesting ground. I thought it was one of the more insightful and informative press conferences he's had, weekly press conferences he's had this season, whether he intended it to be or not. And I doubt he intended it to be all that insightful or informative. I don't think he ever sets out really looking to share insider information, but I think he did, willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly, I think he did share a decent amount at his weekly press conference yesterday. The first thing that we'll go to is sort of newsworthy. I asked him a question, about Rodney Hammond. Panthers senior running back did not play against Virginia on Saturday. He's only played in 4 games this season after being reinstated from his early, from the ineligibility that was announced in August. He got reinstated for the North Carolina game. He played against Carolina, Cal, Syracuse, and SMU. Did not play against Virginia. Because he only played in 4 games, he still has a red shirt available to him. He's played every season of his college career. 2021, he was a freshman. He played that year, and then he played the last 2 years before this whole thing this year. If not for the ineligibility that cost him his first 4 games, I suspect he would already have played in 9 games. Every game Pitt has played this season. Instead, he came in the final, or the 4 games since those first 4, and then didn't play against Virginia. And I think that's what stood out to me, was the not playing against Virginia, because I thought that was curious. I thought, wow, that's interesting. Daniel Carter was the number 2 running back and got the bulk of the snaps, got all of the snaps behind Desmond Reed. I mean, it was Reed, and then it was Carter. And obviously Reed got all the touches. Carter had 3 carries and 1 catch against Virginia, had 6 yards on, 6 rushing yards and 4 receiving yards. He scored a touchdown, but it was Desmond Reed who got all of the touches. 16 handoffs. He caught 2 passes, put up 123 yards of total offense. But noticeably absent was Rodney Hammond. Hammond has only carried the ball twice, even though he's only carried the ball twice, even though he's appeared in 4 games. And actually, let me bring up his snaps. I meant to have this available. I was looking at his game-by-game snaps or stats, but in terms of his snaps, he played in 4 games. He played 12 snaps at North Carolina, 6 against Cal, 11 against Syracuse, and then 20 snaps at SMU. But despite playing those 20 snaps at SMU, he only recorded 2 carries. Picked up 10 yards on those 2, or he had 2 catches, for 10 yards. Rushing wise, he had 4 carries. Goodness. Rushing wise, he had 4 carries for 9 yards at Carolina, 1 for 1 against Cal, 3 for 8 against Syracuse, and then 4 for 17 at SMU, and then he had 2 catches for 10 yards. So that's the entirety of his touches so far through 4 games. 5, 8, 12, 14 touches in 4 games, and then didn't play against Virginia. So when he didn't get on the field, and I looked, and he was in uniform and everything like that on the sideline, I asked Pat Narduzzi, is it under consideration for him to take a red shirt and come back for another year? Because you can play 4 games and still red shirt, under the rule they changed a few years ago. And so it seemed to make sense that maybe this was the plan. When you don't put him on the field, against Virginia. And again, some of these games, they're not getting a lot of running backs on the field because they're, having short possessions, and Desmond Reed is their number one guy. But I asked the question, and Narduzzi said, yeah, that is under consideration. They don't want to play him just to play him and waste that year. They've been sort of planning that. If I sort of got the impression that if they need him, if something happened with Desmond Reed getting hurt, they would probably go to Hammond. Certainly if Reed and Carter got hurt, I think they would absolutely go to Hammond. So he left the door open. It's not an open and shut case. They're not going to not dress him. It'll be interesting to see if he travels to the Louisville game. I imagine he'll be in uniform for the Clemson game this Saturday. But it'll be interesting to see if he even gets on the plane for the final 2 games of the regular season. But it seems like right now that's the intention, is to save him. Now, there's always going to be a question that if you save that year for Rodney Hammond and he uses that year, there's always going to be a question of whether or not he's wearing a Pitt uniform when he uses that year. And that doesn't have anything to do with Rodney Hammond himself or a reflection on anything we know about him. It's just the reality of 2024 that you don't know who's going to be around year to year. You don't know who's going to come back or who's going to leave. And if you preserve Rodney Hammond's eligibility for another year, you let him, you keep him on the sideline, you don't play him more than 4 games, and you let him redshirt, to save that extra year, to give him a chance to play college football again in 2025. The only thing you're really guaranteeing is that he has an opportunity to play college football in 2025. You're not necessarily guaranteeing that he will play college football at Pitt in 2025. Now, he did come back this past year. I think he had options to go in the transfer portal. This past offseason, he opted to return. Obviously feels strongly about Pitt and wants to be a part of it. I think the coaches want him to be a part of it. That's why they haven't just sort of thrown him out there, in the Virginia game particularly, where it would have eliminated his opportunity for a red shirt. But I thought it was interesting that Narduzzi was that forward about it, and that's the intention. Desmond Reed, Daniel Carter will be out of eligibility. We'll see what Derek Davis chooses to do. We'll see what Desmond Reed chooses to do. I would assume that Reed at least will stay at Pitt as long as Cade Bell is here. Davis, I would think, I don't know. He hasn't gotten a ton of opportunities himself. He has 17 carries this season. 5 were in the Kent State game. 6 were in the Youngstown State game. So 11 out of his 17 carries came in those 2 non-conference games. And he's only had 1 carry basically since the conference season started. He had 1 carry for -2 yards at SMU. So not a lot of work there. But again, I'm not going to try and guess what Derek Davis is going to do. But I do think it's interesting that Rodney Hammond, a return is on the table for Hammond coming back in 2024 or 25, potentially to work with Desmond Reed. And who knows what the running game, who knows what the running game would look like with Rodney Hammond out there. Who knows if it would be better or more dangerous, or if he'd be able to make some more things happen. I think Desmond Reed is a pretty explosive weapon, one of the best players on this offense, on this team, and more explosive than Rodney Hammond. But I think Hammond's still a good player and has usefulness and I think can contribute and make an impact. So we'll see what happens there. But I thought it's certainly newsworthy that Narduzzi said, yeah, that's on the table to save Rodney Hammond's eligibility and bring him back for another year. The first question of the press conference, I asked Pat Narduzzi, I think I mentioned this, what options do you have on the table for further adjustments to help improve this offense? You've changed the offensive lineup. You've seen both quarterbacks. You've used a bunch of different receivers and running backs and stuff. What's left that you can kind of do? And the first thing Narduzzi said was something like, can you play wide out for us this week? Like asking me rhetorically. Of course, I can't catch to save my life. And there were one of two things that Narduzzi could mean by that, and maybe both, quite frankly. Haha, joking comment, but the fact that was his response, I think, tells you one of two things. One, which is possible, he was pretty displeased with the play of the wide receivers. Multiple drop passes, maybe some routes that weren't run the way they needed to be run, either in execution or effort, and just generally a pretty poor game from the wide receivers overall. And so that might have been his implication when he said, can you play wide out for us this week? But it also could be a reflection on injuries. Konate Mumpfield and Dejon Reynolds both left the game against Virginia with injuries. Reynolds, I mean, you saw it. You saw how they came out, and those are, Konate Mumfield, the leading receiver on this team with 35 catches for 560 yards and 3 touchdowns. Kenny Johnson is tied with him, with Mumfield, with 35 catches, but he's got less than 400 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. As a brief aside, can you get Kenny Johnson more involved, please? Maybe defenses are looking at it and saying Johnson's the main guy we need to shut down, and to some extent I think they're right. But Kenny Johnson is probably the best receiver on the team, and I think the world of Konate Mumfield. I think Mumfield's really good, and if he is second best receiver on this team, it's not by much. But, you have to get Kenny Johnson more involved. He had 8 catches for 81 yards and a touchdown at SMU. But that was his first touchdown since the Youngstown State game, and the first time he caught more than 4 passes since the West Virginia game. He opened the season against Kent State with 7 for 105 and a touchdown. He didn't touch the ball. He didn't get a reception or he did touch the ball. He had 1 carry for 4 yards. He didn't have a catch against Cincinnati. 5 for 79 against West Virginia, and then the 4 games Youngstown State through Syracuse, he caught 3, 2, 4, and 3 passes. And then against Virginia, he had 3 catches for 33 yards. It just doesn't feel like you're getting as much out of Kenny Johnson as you should. Now, Konate Mumfield is right there with him as the 2 best receivers on this team. Mumfield, the way he left the game, certainly doesn't look promising for his return, but that's just my guess. Dejon Reynolds also left the game. So the other way you could take it, either Narduzzi was complaining about the play of his wide receivers when he asked if I could play wide out for them this week, or he was asking if I could play wide out for them this week because they're down in numbers. As in saying, we don't have many options to replace guys right now. There's no other receivers we can roll in there. Lamar Seymour hasn't been seen since the Kent State game. He hasn't touched the field on offense. Tyreek Robinson seems to be emerging a little bit. He had 1 catch for 20 yards late against Syracuse. He's done a better job returning kicks, although for the final kickoff or final kick return against Virginia, I believe Kenny Johnson was back there. So maybe he's an option that could get out there, but I think they're just feeling like they don't have many options in the receiver room, either due to performance or availability. And I think there's probably a non-zero chance that Konate Mumfield and Dejon Reynolds don't play this weekend. I don't know for sure, and we won't know until the game actually happens. Till we get to the game, we see who's in uniform and who's in street clothes, so to speak. But it seems like there's a possibility of that. And that's concerning. I think Dejon Reynolds is another guy who's been underutilized. I think there are some guys in this offense who are getting overly targeted, and some guys who probably could stand to have a few targets thrown their way, and I think Dejon Reynolds would fit into that latter category. I think Jake Overman, too. Overman didn't have a target against Virginia, but really think you could probably get him the ball a little bit more, because it sort of remarkably and unexpectedly, and going against what I think we all assumed why he was brought here, Jake Overman has become a decent receiving target. But I digress. Could be a thin receiver group when Pitt takes on Clemson on Saturday. Could be thin at a few positions, and I think there's a couple spots that we're watching. Obviously, the receivers, like I just mentioned, and the quarterback. The quarterback's a big one. I don't know if Eli Holstein's going to play this week. When the line first came out and Clemson was favored by 10 or 11 points, that was one of the suggestions or guesses is, well, maybe that means they know Eli Holstein's not going to play. And I think that's a possibility. For him to leave the game like he did for the second time in the last 3 games, even if they're different situations, different injuries, whatever they may be, they're all right around the cranium area, right? I think we can all agree on that whatever it was, and whether it was dirt in his eye or his head hitting off the ground or taking a late shot, they got called for targeting, they all sort of involved the noggin. And I think when you involve the noggin twice out of three games, you start getting a little bit concerned. Probably get concerned when it's once. You have it twice. Now, maybe somebody's sitting out there and they're like, no, you idiot. It really did just have dirt in his eye in the Syracuse game. And once they got it cleaned out, there was just no need for him to go back in the game, whatever. Fine. I think he went to the locker room. But maybe that was it. Okay? I'm still sort of keeping an eye on that. I still think there's some red flags there. And it wouldn't be a surprise to me at all. And this is not my wink way of telling you I know something that I don't, because I don't. But I would not be surprised at all if Eli Holstein's not available this Saturday, just given how he left that last game. And so you're dealing with some injury situation. This is after they're already down Branson Taylor, creating an issue on the offensive line. I mean, there's some injury issues to watch here. Rashad Battle didn't play in that game. Put Tamon Lynam into the starting lineup for the first time. He ended up with an interception, first career interception. And I think that might be it. I forget. Jordan Bass left the Virginia game with an injury. I forget if he came back at some point. Reserve linebacker, but still a guy who's been seeing the field a lot. So there's a few injuries to keep an eye on there. And then the final thing I wanted to touch on real quick, and I probably should save this for like a whole episode itself. Pat Narduzzi was asked a question yesterday. What are the lessons you want Eli Holstein to take away from the Virginia game? Narduzzi's answer, quote, I thought he made some really good decisions. Coach Bell, I think you guys talked to Coach Bell later in the week, which, brief aside, interviewing the offensive coordinator, in my opinion, should happen every week. Pat Narduzzi decides which weeks it happens. I'm glad that he picked this week. I look forward to talking to him. Resuming the quote. Eli made some good decisions. Just didn't throw the ball as well as we wanted him to. Wasn't as accurate. A couple times up the middle, he wasn't as accurate as he's been. But as far as his decision-making and putting the ball where it's supposed to go, he did that more often than not. End quote. And I think that's really interesting. Because I wonder if, when you're making good decisions, you're making the right reads, but you're missing the throws, I think that's often a sign of you're pressing. You're pressing a little too hard. He's got Konate Mumfield on exactly the look that he wanted, and he puts the ball in the dirt at his feet, at Mumfield's feet. You're pressing a little too hard. You're just a little too stressed. You're a little too tense. You're a little on edge. That when that play is actually there, I gotta get it to him. Don't mess it up. Gotta get it to him. Now, I don't know if that's what's going through Eli Holstein's mind, but if you tell me he's making the right decisions, but he's just not making the throws, and he's not making the throws that he made earlier in the season, his accuracy's off a little bit, it sort of tracks, right? It sort of lines up with that kind of explanation for it. And what that got me thinking about is, I think this is what sort of starts to happen overall. And maybe it lends itself to some of the drop passes we've seen, some of the missed throws that we've seen. Nate Yarnell trying for it all on 2nd and 10 from the Virginia 47 with minute 46 left to play. And 2 timeouts. There's no reason to try to push the ball 30 yards downfield there or 25 yards downfield or wherever it was. I mean, yeah, if you have a shot, if it's wide open and there's no chance of it getting intercepted, sure, you can take a shot. But otherwise, you're at the 47. Yeah, you need a touchdown, but you're at the 47. It's 2nd and 10. You've got 2 timeouts and 106 seconds on the clock. You have plenty of time to chip away. You have plenty of time to 7 and 8 yard your way down the field. You don't need to take that shot unless you're trying to win the entire game with one play. And I think when you've got you're coming off of one loss and you're in a tough spot there where you feel like you're about to take another loss. And then you put that in the context of 4 pretty rough games on offense, you start to press. You start to want to be the hero. You start to want to be the one who breaks the offense out of their slump. You make that big play and that everything turns around and it creates the momentum. And maybe some of the drops go back to that. The guys were just trying to make the play before they had the ball secured. Maybe that's where some of that comes from. I don't know. But I think this is part of the pressure that grows when you're struggling. And you feel like you're the side of the ball that is really letting the team down, which, yeah, the offense didn't play well enough to win against Cal. They didn't play well enough to win against Syracuse, and obviously didn't play well enough to win against Virginia. They didn't play well enough to win against SMU either, but nobody did in that game. I think you start to press, and I think you start getting a little on edge, and you start trying to run for a 50-yard touchdown before you even have the ball secured on the catch. You start throwing it into the dirt, when you get an open receiver because you're so amped up to make sure you make the right throw. Now, there's no good solution here. You can tell them to relax, and let me tell you, there's nothing that has caused someone to be unrelaxed more than telling them to relax. I think we all know that. You want to make sure that someone doesn't calm down, just tell them to calm down. That's the oldest that's today's psychology lesson from Chris Peak and Panther-Lair.com. There's no good solution. You just have to start hitting a few passes, making a few plays, getting in some rhythm. But I do think this offense is feeling it right now. I think they're feeling the pressure right now. I think they're really feeling the weight of struggling for the last for the last 4 games. I think the offense is feeling the weight of just not playing well enough to win. So take a load off Eli. Take a load for free. Take a load off Eli and just put the load right on Reed. See, right out of nowhere, we can just have classic gold lines here on the Morning Pit. Not even planned. I'll show you my legal pad. It's got a lot of these things we wanted to talk about. Nowhere in there did I say I was going to quote the band. We're just good like that. Tuesdays are good days, man. Tuesdays are good days. All right, we'll talk a little hoops tomorrow, recap last night's game, and then, of course, get you ready for the live show tomorrow night where we'll talk about all the football, all the basketball, all the recruiting, everything else going on in the world of Pitt sports. So make sure you tune in for that. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. And check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I hope you had a great weekend aside from that game. Hope your week got off to a good start yesterday on Monday. And, enjoy your Tuesday. We'll catch up with you tomorrow morning for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.